Woo!
Welcome to Night Talks, the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications talk show produced by students for students. I'm Daisy Prosser, a senior studying journalism, and our guest today is Craig Fugate. He's the former director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management from 2001 to 2009, and the former administrator of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, from 2009 to 2017. He now consults in the areas of emergency management and crisis response. Hi, Craig. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Your experience at county, state, and federal levels of emergency management is amazing. Though, let's start back at when you attended Santa Fe College studying to be a paramedic. What led you to this field, and what inspired your passion for helping others?
I grew up in a little town just north of here, Alachua. I wasn't out of high school, but maybe a couple of months, and some local folks who knew me, because it's a small town, everybody knows you, said, we need some new volunteer firefighters. Would you be interested? And I knew a lot of people I went to church with. And so I said, well, that sounds interesting. So what do I got to do? And so they would have like weekly meetings and they'd do some training. You'd hold the hoses and squirt water. And I'm like, well, this is cool. And they said, oh, we need you to go to EMT school. And I'm thinking, okay. Well, it turned out there was like an age difference. The older people that were in the fire department weren't interested in getting up all night and run calls, because that's what you got, a lot more emergency calls. So I went to EMT school, and it was done through Santa Fe, at that time, Santa Fe Community College. And I went through that course and got my EMT. I got some people saying, hey, why don't you go down to the Florida State Fire College and get your minimum standards? So I went down to the Florida State Fire College, and I went through the fire academy down there, and I took all the requirements to become a professional firefighter. But I was still a volunteer. And then I got out of that, and then it was like I got hired by Alachua County. I started driving ambulances. And so my next step was to go to paramedic school. So all through this, it wasn't that I'd grown up wanting to be one, but I grew up watching, there's this old TV show that if you grew up in my generation was like this really cool show called Emergency. And it was interesting because it was a show about Los Angeles Fire Department, a rescue squad, and paramedics. And it was really the first time the idea of paramedics was being introduced to people across the nation. Yet here in Alachua County, we had paramedics, one of the earliest counties to have like 911 and paramedic program and doing the pre-hospital care. So, I always remember that show, and I always saw myself, Johnny Engage and all the stuff they would do, and I was like, that's really cool. So I kind of migrated in that direction. Alachua County kept growing, began providing fire services. And ultimately, I was starting out in the county as I was an EMT, then I was a paramedic, and ultimately I became a lieutenant with Alachua County Fire Rescue. You start out, working, as a basically, brand new employee. You move up, you now begin getting more supervisory roles, and so by the time I made lieutenant, I was now responsible for supervising the day-to-day as well as during the emergency response.
You served as the emergency manager for Alachua County from 1987 to 1997. What were some of the events you oversaw in this role, and what action could be taken in case of the worst emergency?
Well, we would have occasionally various chemical emergencies. Those were actually some of the biggest ones. There was a chemical facility out near the Gainesville airport that had a chemical release, and it crossed basically across State Road 24, got into some of the mobile home parks there, and big cloud. So we ended up having to do a lot of evacuating, sheltering in place. We had a lot of people now showing up in the emergency rooms because of irritations. That went on for a better part of an evening to get that resolved. One of the things that I think, and it was an early lesson, and that was during this chemical emergency, we had this very toxic white cloud crossing the road, and people were driving through it. And the law enforcement was trying to stop people, and they're driving through it. And what were they doing? They were driving home to get their pets. Afterwards, I got a lot of criticism because we said shelter in place. People called up and complained we didn't tell them to bring their pets inside. Most of the complaints we actually got about that involved pets. And it was A lot of people were very dismissive of that, but it started teaching me very valuable lessons. When we're talking about disasters, companion animals, there's a tendency to separate that and go, well, they're not as important as people. And I'm like, you're looking at this wrong. It isn't a pet problem, it's a people problem. Because if people are going to go in harm's way to rescue their pets, then you need to figure out how you're going to rescue their pets.
In 1997, you were appointed Bureau Chief for Preparedness and Response for the Florida Division of Emergency Management. What led to that appointment?
I got a phone call. Everybody says, how'd you get all these jobs? I said, I answered my phone, and they think I'm kidding. I'm like, no. I got a phone call from the state director one weekend. His deputy had left to go back to the state of North Carolina to become state director. His name was Eric Tolbert. So the director at the time, Joe Myers, called me up and says, hey, Eric's left. I want you to come in and be the bureau chief. It was a good time because I'd been at the county and done pretty much everything that I could do with what I had. We built a good team. I was like getting what's next. And so when the phone call came, I was ready to go. Joe interviewed me, he offered me the job, and I went to work for the state. And it was like, it was May of 97. I can remember I gave my notice to the county, and then 2 weeks later started working in the state. And I literally worked my last day in Alachua County on a Friday, and the next Monday started my job in Tallahassee. So there's really no break. People say, oh, you take 2 weeks off. I went from one job to the next job over a weekend.
So in 2001, you became the director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management. Was this a role you were working toward?
Not really. I had reached a point where I'd gotten about as far as I was going to go in the state. I didn't ever really see myself as being the state director. I wasn't politically connected. And I had had some conversations with people at FEMA about going up to FEMA and working in the response section up there. But then my boss, Joe Myers, the person that brought me to the state, decided to leave, go to the private sector. Governor Bush appointed me as the interim director. And so we went through that hurricane center season. I wasn't sure what they were looking for. They said they were going to do this national search, but nothing was really going on. I was actually at the national conference for the state emergency managers up in Montana when 9/11 hit. And so we came back, we were dealing with the rest of hurricane season. We were dealing with the aftermath of all the 9/11 stuff. And Governor Bush calls me up. I'm announcing the new Secretary of Health tomorrow, and I'm going to announce you as the director full time. And I'm like, I'm honored. Thank you, sir. And he says, but you're going to have to change your affiliation. And I'm thinking, I don't know what to say. I really want this job, but I'm not sure it's really worth that I got to change my political affiliation. And after a long pause, he said, you'd turn me down, wouldn't you? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I guess I can have one Gator on my team. And that was it. He never once questioned my political affiliations. To him, it was less important that I was registered as a Democrat, more important that my work and my qualifications. So that's when it started. It was right in the aftermath of 9/11.
You guys did a lot of training, and he was very hands-on. So what were some situations where that training came to fruition, and how did it kind of play out?
I think, there's this thing we call lessons learned after disasters. And sometimes the lessons that people think they learned may not be what was important. So after Hurricane Andrew, there was a big disconnect in the first day of what people thought had happened and what had really happened. So the county EOC and the state were basically thinking they had dodged a bullet. They weren't getting a lot of reports of damage, and where they did see damage, it was about what you'd expect from a hurricane, but it wasn't anything catastrophic. What they didn't know was essentially Miami-Dade County from about 122nd Street south, there was no phone lines, and it was total devastation. And the lack of 911 calls, they thought indicated it wasn't that bad. So they lost about a day. So the thought was after Hurricane Andrew, we got to get in faster and do assessments to know it's bad and to send help. Well, it turned out all that sending people down there to do the assessments took about another day. So we weren't really saving any time. I wanted to really just start responding and send people in. And they were going, well, how do you know it's bad? How do you know how many people? I'm like, well, it's a hurricane. We kind of know what those look like. We know where it's coming ashore. We know how many people live there. We can get a pretty good estimate. And what I found was speed was probably the most important thing. The faster we got into communities and the hours after the storm passed, the better the outcome was. We got to the point where as soon as the tropical force winds passed, we started pushing people in there. We said, we're not waiting for blue skies or sunlight. We're going. And that we kicked off with Hurricane Charlie. We did it through the rest of the 04 and 05 hurricane seasons, and we got faster and faster to the point where I remember when Hurricane Dennis hit in 2005, we were literally handing out supplies 12 hours after the storm passed through. By 2005, when we got hit by Hurricane Wilma, towards the end of that year, there was already a lot of resources had been soaked up because of Katrina and Hurricane Rita. There wasn't much stuff left. And while we were struggling to get things up and running, we really weren't paying attention to the fact that the private sector, like Florida chains like Publix and Winn-Dixie and others, where normally when the power would be out, their stores were closed. Well, after the 04 hurricane season, they began bringing in generators, extra crews, restocking their stores. And it turned out in most cases, they were open before we got there to set up. And we, in many cases, found ourselves setting up where they were already open to hand out free supplies. And it was now evident that we were A, competing with the private sector, but B, we were missing the most vulnerable communities. And so in talking with the private sector, talking with Governor Bush, we kind of changed our philosophy that rather than just coming in and setting up automatically after the storms, we would talk to the private sector in that initial phase. We weren't going to slow anything down. But what we would do is if you're open or you can get open, we're going to draw a circle around that and go, we're not going to put anything there. And then we're going to look for where the gaps are. It turns out where the gaps are tended to be the rural, poor areas of the state that we didn't get to often until the second or third day. Now we could get there on day one because we weren't having to send supplies into the heavily populated areas, because in many cases, the private sector could get those supplies up and running. We could go to the Pahokies and Belglades that we weren't getting to until day 2 or day 3, instead of focusing on West Palm Beach, where it turned out there was a lot of open grocery stores, even with the power out, because they had learned in the hurricane season in the last couple of years, they needed to get generators, they needed to get open. And so that really started changing the dynamic of going from government-centric to really looking at what ultimately we started calling the whole of community. But like, what can the private sector get? And a different question we needed to ask. What do you need from us to get open? Instead of what can you do for us? And this is where the Waffle House Index came from. If the Waffle House is closed because of the disaster, it's red. If it's open with a limited menu, it's yellow. And if it's open, got a full menu, it's green. And it would have probably stopped there, except we kept getting hit by hurricanes. Remember I said we weren't going to wait to know how bad it was? Problem is, if you're driving out on Interstate 10, like for Hurricane Ivan, you're going to start seeing damages well before you get to where it went ashore. So the question is, when do you stop and go to work? And so they began using this rough rule of thumb. If the Waffle House is open, it's got a full menu, it's not that bad, keep going. If the Waffle House is open, it's got a limited menu, we've had power outages, may have disrupted water, that's mass care, that's not search and rescue. But if you get there and the Waffle House is closed because of the storm, those are heavily impacted areas. Go to work. And that's the origin of it. And then we would brief on that, and people found that fascinating. But it was interesting that it gave us the ability to look at something that is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, doesn't close, and has shown a history of getting open quickly after disasters as a way of doing a quick assessment of impacts to a community by looking at infrastructure, in this case, a restaurant. It's kind of followed me around, but it's interesting that it works pretty good from being able to do like a quick snapshot of how a community's faring. Because think about it, if a Waffle House is open, that means the workers had to have a place to stay. They had to be able to get there, so the roads may have debris, but they were able to get there. The building's got to be safe enough to operate. They can operate without water or electricity. They have ways, they'll bring in bottled water and do stuff like that. And customers can get there. If they're closed, none of that's true. And if they're open and got a full menu, there may be damages, but you know now that your power and water system is pretty well intact, and that a lot of what you're going to be doing is just cleanup. There's not going to be a lot of other things you have to do for that recovery.
For sure. That's interesting. So tell us about 2005, the response to Hurricane Katrina, and why Florida launched a mutual aid response in support of other impacted states.
A lot of things, what I call the modern era of emergency management in Florida, goes back to Hurricane Andrew. And after Hurricane Andrew, the late Governor Childs at the time, realized that in these types of storms, states would be the fastest assistance to each other. There was this tendency to always depend upon the federal government. But Governor Childs realized that states could help each other as well. So he launched a compact between the southern governors to assist each other responding to disasters. And then that grew and became what's called the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. And when Hurricane Katrina was occurring, Florida was a signature of that. And so we had people came and helped us during 2004 hurricanes from Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. So when Katrina hit Florida, people forget this, but it hit as a Category 1, went across the Everglades, came out, was originally heading towards us and the Panhandle. We had gotten a lot of resources because the thing we learned is you don't get time back. So we wouldn't wait till the storm hits to start moving people. Florida's a big state, so we were moving people out of South Florida, Southwest Florida, Central Florida, and the Northeast coast. And we were moving them and staging them, which means basically parking the people and the equipment just outside of the storm. And so we had a lot of people at the Tallahassee Fairgrounds and surrounding areas. And when the storm track moved further to the west and Florida was outside of that cone, a lot of people thought, well, we're done, we can go home. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure somebody's going to need us. So we were talking, we were doing conference calls with our neighboring states, and we kind of worked it out. Texas would support Louisiana. We would either get hit or we'd support Mississippi because my counterpart, Bruce Bauman in Alabama, and I both knew that the Gulf Shores and Pensacola are too close together. So if we get hit, we're busy. So what Bruce said, hey, Craig, if you guys aren't hit, just go through. I'll deal with what I got because I'm not going to be, if you're not hit, I'm not hit that bad. And as soon as I can get folks, we'll go in. And so that night when Katrina hit, we actually had search and rescue crews moving across the state. Now this is coordinated between the states. And when our first crews got out there, and again, this is like the sun hasn't even come up, they were already seeing the devastation. And as we talked to Mississippi, it became evident that they were hit, and the tendency is to focus on the coast, but that storm had actually gone up to the middle of the state. So they had damages all the way up to Jackson. They couldn't get down there. Roads were all blocked. It was actually turned out easier to get from Florida to those southern coastal counties in Mississippi than it was for Mississippi to get from the middle of the state down because of all the damage. So we increased our response, ultimately sent about 6,000 responders, volunteer agencies, private sector. Again, it was our whole team. We basically took the approach that those southern coastal counties, whatever they needed, we were working through the state EOC, we would treat them like a Florida county. So that was the largest response that the state had ever done in a mutual aid. But it was all based upon the legacy and lessons that we learned from Hurricane Andrew.
Absolutely. So in 2009, you were sworn in as FEMA administrator by Barack Obama. Did you have to campaign at all for the opportunity, or were you surprised when he selected you?
No, it's the classic, I got a phone call. I got a phone call, people that were involved in the transition team, would you consider? And I'm like, well, my first answer is not to say no, but I'm not looking. Hung up. A couple of weeks later, I got another call. Could you put down on paper your resume and stuff like that? Well, I don't really have a resume. I'm not looking. I'm happy. At that time, I was working for Governor Chris. And well, could you put something down? So I put some stuff down, and I sent it in. And I thought, well, that'd be the end of it. And then I got another call. Would I come up and meet the new Secretary of Homeland Security? And I'm like, sure, when? Well, can you come up tomorrow? No. Well, what about Friday? No, I'm busy. I have a job. I'm already scheduled stuff. Well, you do understand this is the Secretary of Homeland Security who wants to interview you. And I'm like, yeah, I got that, but I already have a job. I can be up there next Wednesday. And they were a little bit, disappointed that I didn't rush up there. So I go up there, I meet with, it was Janet Napolitano, I meet with her, and we talked for a while. She was asking me about my philosophy, about response and all this stuff. She was a governor of Arizona, so she knew about state emergency management. And so we went through this thing. The only two questions that really I remember, because everything else kind of a blur, was did I pay my taxes and had I ever had an undocumented person working for me? And I'm like, no, ma'am, I work for state government. We can't afford, and then I went home, and it was never said what I was interviewing for. Later that week, there was an article that came out in the Washington Post talking about, the guessing game of who's getting what, and my name was mentioned as one of the possible candidates for FEMA administrator. Now, I had told the governor's staff, I got called up and they were very supportive of it. Governor Chris calls me up and congratulates me. I said, sir, I'm not even sure, they haven't told me anything. And then I get this call from White House Office of Personnel. Now they start the vetting process. Now it gets serious because now I got to go through background checks. I got to go through the security clearance checks. I go through all your financial records. I mean, it was like a very invasive process. They still haven't told me what I'm doing. And finally I get the call. Their intention is to nominate me to be the FEMA administrator. And they're going to announce it. So I said, well, before you announce it, I got to tell, there's three things I got to do. I got to tell my wife, they said, obviously, I need to tell my team, and I need to tell my governor. I can remember one thing Governor Christie says, Craig, I don't want your resignation. We don't know how this is going to go. You're my guy. If it doesn't turn out, you're still my guy. He said, when you get confirmed, you'll resign.
As you look back, how do you define your time of success at FEMA?
There was a lot of things we did. We had a lot of responses and things I thought we did better and things we could have done better and things we didn't do well at all. We changed what we were calling people in disasters. And you'll still see this on news and stuff. They call the people in disasters victims. And I said, we're not using that term. We're going to call them survivors. And the reason why is I look at the public as part of the team. And if we're calling them victims, we're basically saying, don't do anything or you're not going to do anything and you got to be saved by us. And I'm like, I've been to a lot of disasters. Nobody's waiting to be saved by FEMA. So let's get it through our heads. They're the survivors. Our job is to support them. The victims are the ones we lost and we'll mourn. But everybody else is a survivor. And don't think 1 minute they're waiting on you to tell them how to survive. What we need to do is be supportive and get in there and make sure we're helping the state and local governments get things back online. But we need to see the public as part of the team. Second thing was, when I got there, I went out and met with a lot of groups. You go out, you get paraded around. And so one of the groups I met was the Native Americans, the tribal governments. And they were used to agencies coming in and talking at them, and they were pretty resigned to that. So I went in there, and I remember they had me in this room, they had me up on the stage, and I'd got some good staff. They were telling me the backstory and stuff like that, and things like that. I said, okay, we're going to do something different. I ain't doing a speech. I sat down on the stage. And I said, tell me what I need to know. And the tribes unloaded. Well, first of all, it turns out we recognize them everywhere else in the federal government as sovereign governments, except in FEMA. The way Congress wrote our statute, they're treated as political subdivisions of the states they're in. So if you're familiar with the Seminole tribe is a sovereign government, not subjected or under state government. But in a disaster, we would tell the Seminole tribe, if you want federal assistance, you have to go through the state, and they wouldn't do it. And this was true across the entire country. And I said, okay, it took us about this was in the beginning, it took us about 6 years to get the legislation changed. We got it changed, the 5th year, we got it changed in the aftermath of the Sandy disaster. We got a lot of things done. So one of the pieces we got done is we changed the tribal governments from being part of the political subdivisions of the states to being in the same category as states, territories, and federally recognized tribes. And so to me, it was writing something that I found that was grievously wrong. But most people said, well, this is going to be too much work. It's going to be too hard. You're going to add over 500 governments now that can ask for disasters. This is going to get out of control. And it turned out it didn't. And to me, that was probably, of all the things we did legislatively, was the one that fixed something I consider very wrong, that we were treating our federally recognized tribes as basically subdivisions of a state government when they weren't.
I think that's amazing. So describe your interaction with the press media. Was it useful during crises, or did it create its own hazard to effective emergency messaging?
Well, I was well trained, and I was well trained by the School of Journalism here at the University of Florida. And I never took a course here. But there was a professor here, Tom Krinsky, who would take his journalism students and send them over to interview me on just about anything you could think of, whether it was getting ready for hurricane season or the shipment of nuclear waste on highways or, chemical storage. And so to a certain degree, I got trained doing these interviews because I was doing that on a fairly frequent basis. And again, they thought they were getting the training, they were training me. I learned some valuable lessons. First of all, when you ask me a question, I don't have to answer the question. I can say whatever I want to say, that too, listen to the questions. And what I got taught was the media has a production schedule. It's like a clock. And if you understand that clock, you should then time your press releases and your press conferences so it fits their clock. So don't be doing a press conference 5 minutes before they go live with the news, unless you're the live shot. Because you think about it, during disasters, there's two roles here. We need the media to help us communicate and tell the public what's going on. They also have the job of reporting what we did well, and more importantly, what we didn't do well. But you can't confuse the two. If you don't know something, that's okay, but let us know how long it's going to take you to find that out. So we'll know when to come back for that, and don't make stuff up. Don't feel you have to say something because we're asking a question if you don't know. Saying, I don't know, and when I find out, or here's what we're doing to get the information, is a perfectly acceptable answer.
Interesting. Yeah. So most recently, you're consulted on emergency management. What kind of services do you provide, and do you still interact much with the national media?
Yeah, I get a lot of calls because I'm like the has-been. They'll call me up and I'll get questions about what about this, what about that. So I get those kind of questions. I'm also involved in a lot of the policy space. I do work. I'm on a couple of boards with American Public Television stations. So all of the PBS stations. I do work in advising for Florida Public Media, which is NPR, and the PBS stations in Florida. I do a lot of the stuff I used to do when I was full-time, except I don't manage people, and I pick the projects I want to do. Because the one thing I told everybody was I was coming back home to Gainesville. Everybody says, well, you could do a lot better if you lived in DC or somewhere else. I'm like, I do pretty good in Gainesville, so I'm home.
Thank you so much for your insight, Craig. And thank you so much to our viewers for joining us. Until next time, good night.